As you mentioned in your testimony, between 2001 and 2023, there were 96 nationwide injunctions issued, of which 64 were granted against President Trump. Well, why do you think the courts have issued nationwide injunctions against President Trump with such frequency? It's kind of a question we're all pondering right now.
Hey there, Patriots. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into a very serious and concerning topic, something that, as conservatives, we've seen happening time and time again. We're talking about the radical, activist judges who are intentionally blocking President Trump's agenda, and let me tell you folks, it's a real problem. We've got some thoughts on this, so buckle up and let's break it down. Recently, Congressman Scott Fitzgerald spoke out about this growing issue in a video that really hit home for me. He raised some absolutely crucial points about how activist judges have been actively undermining not just Trump's presidency, but the very fabric of our democratic system. This is something we all need to be paying attention to, because these judges are acting like they're more powerful than the president, more powerful than Congress, and frankly, more powerful than the will of the American people. And I'm here to tell you, that's not okay. Now, let's talk about these nationwide injunctions. You may have heard of them. They're a relatively new phenomenon that has been used to block policies put forward by the Trump administration, and they are completely out of control. According to Fitzgerald, this started picking up in the 1960s and 70s when Congress started authorizing federal agencies to make rules without much oversight. But over time, the system has been hijacked. These nationwide injunctions, which were supposed to be rare and used sparingly, have now become a tool used by liberal judges to overreach and stop the president from doing his job. It's no longer about interpreting the law, it's about playing politics, and that's a major issue.
Nationwide injunctions, they're a relatively new phenomenon, right? Isn't that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, it's fair to say nationwide injunctions became more commonplace in the 60s and 70s, and that is because Congress began authorizing general rulemaking by federal agencies, such as passage of Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act.
Well, there are several factors that led to the late development of it. One is a change in philosophy of what it meant to say that something was unconstitutional. For example, Professor Samuel Bray explained this at length in his article. Traditionally, when a court said something was unconstitutional, it meant the government could not enforce it against you. Over time, courts gradually began to say, no, that means you can't force it against anybody. The problem is that overlooks the role that a district court judge has both horizontally and vertically within the federal system. No one district court judge can bind the appellate court or the Supreme Court. No one district court judge in Maine can bind a district court judge or any judge in Alaska. And so, unfortunately, this practice developed, and we didn't have anybody stepping back and saying, no, wait a minute, are there constitutional, statutory, et cetera, limitations on it? And it has actually hurt both parties, because each party has suffered through this process.
Thank you. Speaker Gingrich, as you mentioned in your testimony, between 2001 and 2023, there were 96 nationwide injunctions issued, of which 64 were granted against President Trump. Well, why do you think the courts have issued nationwide injunctions against President Trump with such frequency? It's kind of a question we're all pondering right now.
You know, one of my favorite books on the law is The Bramble Bush, which is the 1929 introductory lectures at Columbia Law School, and which draws a distinction between the law as it is practiced and the law as it is written. So let's just, at a common sense level, be honest. Donald Trump represents a profound, fundamental shaking up of a very deeply resistant establishment, which can be traced back to Franklin Roosevelt in 1933. You take on a system that's almost 100 years old, the system fights back. The last great bastion of power held by the left is district court judges and their allies on the Supreme Court. And they're behaving, as a historian, this is a perfectly natural thing. They're doing everything they can to stop the president, who was elected by millions of Americans. They were elected by no one, but under our system, they have a certain amount of power. Not nearly as much as the modern legal system believes, because the 1958 decision by the Supreme Court, which said we are supreme, is baloney. The Supreme Court is supreme in Article 3. It is not supreme over the whole Constitution. And I think we're now going to face a genuinely important, historic conversation as a country about whether or not unelected judges on a randomized basis, who happen to be 92% Democrat, have the power to stop the elected commander-in-chief on item after item after item. My guess is the American people will say to the legislative branch, you got to be kidding me. And if Justice Roberts wants to cut this off, he should act now, because this is going to get worse, not better.
Thank you. Mr. Larkin, I'll just finish up with a quick question about forum shopping. It's something that's clearly been happening, and we're used to it at the state level within the judiciary as well as at the federal level. I was wondering if you had a comment about that.
Sure. I mean, the problem is attempted to be avoided by having random assignment. But unfortunately, there are some times when there's only a limited number of judges in a particular district. And as the result, if there's only one, that's who you're going to get. If there are two, you have a 50% chance. And people wind up doing this, not surprisingly, because they think Judge A is going to give them a better likelihood of success. Now, that's bad enough when what you're talking about is a damages action, because that damages action is going to result in a check, perhaps, that goes just to one party. It's different when you're talking about having one judge in any one town enjoying the entirety of the federal government across the nation. That's a much more severe problem, and that's why this is a reasonable effort to cabin that. And, picking favorable judges is a reason why.
Thank you. I'd yield back.
Fitzgerald pointed out something incredibly important, something that a lot of people don't seem to realize. District court judges are not supposed to have the power to make nationwide decisions. That's not their job. In fact, no single district court judge can bind the entire country. But somehow these liberal judges have decided they can impose their rulings on all of us, and that's where things get dangerous. Did you hear that? They've redefined what it means to declare something unconstitutional. It's no longer just about one person. It's about preventing the government from enforcing policies across the entire nation. The result? A few unelected left-wing judges are able to put a halt to policies that were democratically elected. And these policies were put forward by President Trump, someone we, the American people, chose to lead this country. Yet, time and time again, these judges have stood in the way of the president's agenda. Now, let's talk about the frequency with which these nationwide injunctions have been used against President Trump. From 2001 to 2023, there have been 96 nationwide injunctions, and guess what? A whopping 64 of those have been against President Trump. That's not just a coincidence, folks. This is a coordinated effort to sabotage his presidency and stop his agenda at all costs. And why is that happening? Well, Fitzgerald doesn't shy away from the truth. He says it's because Trump represents a direct challenge to the entrenched establishment. That's right. Trump is shaking up a system that's been in place for nearly 100 years. And let's be real, this is a system that was built by the left, maintained by the left, and supported by left-wing judges. And now that Trump is in office, they're doing everything they can to stop him. These activist judges aren't just protecting the Constitution, they're protecting their own power and their own political agendas. And that, my friends, is a serious problem. We all know what's going on here. These judges are afraid. They're afraid of losing control. They're afraid of what happens if the people, the real American people, get a president who actually listens to them and works for them. They don't want to give up their power, so they're using every trick in the book to undermine Trump's presidency. But let me tell you, patriots, they are not fooling us. These judges, these so-called activists, they don't represent the people. They represent their own political interests. And I think it's time for the American people to stand up and say, enough is enough. If we let these unelected judges have this much power, we're giving them control over our entire country. We can't allow that. Look at these crowds. Look at the millions of Americans who voted for President Trump. We, the people, chose him to lead. These judges? They were appointed by previous administrations, many of whom had an agenda that wasn't aligned with what the American people want. And now they're blocking policies that are good for our country. Whether it's border security, economic growth, or national defense, these judges are putting their own political interests over the will of the people. And the worst part? They know exactly what they're doing. They're not just interpreting the law, they're trying to shape the law to fit their liberal left-wing agenda. They're picking and choosing which policies they want to stop, and they're doing it with zero accountability. And let me tell you, if this doesn't change, it's going to get worse. We've already seen it. I want to end this by talking about forum shopping. Now, I know a lot of you might not be familiar with that term, but it's a huge issue in the courts. It's when liberal groups or activists shop for judges who are more likely to rule in their favor. And unfortunately, the system doesn't always stop this from happening. Sometimes, there are only a few judges in certain districts, and these activists know exactly which ones are most likely to rule the way they want. That's why it's so important we address this issue now, before it gets completely out of hand. Let's be clear, patriots. This is about more than just President Trump. This is about our freedom, our sovereignty, and our future as a nation. If we let these unelected judges dictate our policies, we're no longer in control of our own country. The people need to be the ones who decide what happens here, not some liberal judge who's more interested in advancing a political agenda than upholding the Constitution. So, let's keep fighting, patriots. Let's make our voices heard. Let's stand up to these activist judges and remind them who really holds the power in this country, the American people. If you agree with me, if you're ready to stand up for the rule of law and the people's right to choose their leaders, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video. We need to get the word out. This fight isn't over, and we're just getting started. Stay strong, patriots, and God bless America.